So, when we think about humans and where humans have lived over history, we know that we've had a pattern of increasing urbanization. And so, urbanization is the movement of people from more rural areas into urban areas, into cities. We can see here, this is the share of people living in urban areas in different parts of the world since 1500. And so if you look back 500 years ago, very few people lived in urban areas. But once we reached industrialization, we see that rapidly rise, and we see that increasingly people have and are continuing to move to cities. And that process is called urbanization. And this is tied to something that we sometimes talk about is urban sprawl. And urban sprawl is sort of the expansion of those suburban areas. So we know that people can live in city centers in dense areas of population. But then we have those outlying areas that we call the suburbs, where we have more single family homes and we have a much lower density of residents. And that expansion into those suburban areas, is, we sometimes refer to that as urban sprawl. And those suburban areas are growing into the more rural areas surrounding those urban areas. And so when we have concentrations of people living in very densely populated areas, that can lead to certain impacts that are negative, but it also can lead to certain benefits as well in terms of the environment. And so when you have people living in dense urban areas, it can lead to stresses for resources such as drinking water. It can lead to problems with disposing of the waste, of the solid waste, as well as wastewater is a factor that needs to be taken into account. Also, when we think about in these suburban areas, in these areas where we have this suburban sprawl of single-family households, those are areas in which people rely heavily on individual vehicles. Those suburban areas might not have access to any public transportation. Individuals may have to do a lot more driving in a suburban area than they might if they live in an urban area. Urban areas are also subject to the heat island effect. The heat island effect is an effect that happens related to the temperature. And in urban areas, we typically see much higher temperatures than in the surroundings, and we can see that here. And why is that? Well, it's high density of energy use, which leads to increases in temperature. There's much more paved and asphalt surfaces, which absorb more heat. And so if you look at sort of a downtown urban area, we can see 5 or 6 degree Fahrenheit difference between areas that have very similar weather patterns. But if we go into the surroundings around those urban areas, we can see, a 5-6 degree drop off in temperature. So that urban heat island effect is important, especially as climate changes and as global average temperatures increase. In these urban areas, we may need to create cooling centers, areas where people have access to cooler temperatures, because especially in some parts of the developing world, air conditioning is not prevalent. And so when climate is changing and temperatures are increasing, it could lead to large numbers of people suffering from heat-related stress and illness. And that process is called the heat island effect, where cities tend to be much warmer than their surrounding counterparts. There's also the issue of resource use. Many cities are in coastal areas. And so when you have large numbers of people in these coastal areas, they are withdrawing large amounts of water. And so if that water is coming from aquifers that are coastal, we can see here an example of what's called a saltwater intrusion. Here we have houses depending on a well into a freshwater aquifer to withdraw that drinking water. But we know as sea level rises, the level of the salt water, there's a mix of salt and fresh water in these aquifers in coastal areas. The fresh water is less dense, so it's on top so we can access it. Salt water is more dense, but as sea level rises, that level of salt water in the aquifer also rises. If it intrudes into this freshwater well, well, this well then is no longer useful for drinking water because it's contaminated with salt water. And or the other process that can happen if we overdraw, if we have a very dense urban area withdrawing large amounts of fresh water from this aquifer, can end up overdrawing and bringing with it some of this salt water, contaminating the well, making it unusable again. This process that happens is called a saltwater intrusion. Another issue is runoff. When in urban areas we have increased impervious surfaces, roads, roofs, parking lots, buildings, those are impervious to precipitation typically, and the water sits on the surface and has to be funneled into either a storm water management system, like a catch basins and so forth, or it just runs off. If we were to compare a more natural ground cover versus an urban impervious ground cover, in natural ground cover, what we have is about 25% of precipitation infiltrates into the soil, into the groundwater, deeply. Another 25% is held in the soil in a shallow infiltration. The plants and producers absorb much of that and release some of it back into the atmosphere, and only about 10% would typically run off. If we look at an urban setting, there's much less infiltration, both deep infiltration and shallow, because most of the surface is impervious to water. And we have much greater levels of runoff. Over half of the water might run off, posing risks of flooding, and also that runoff in urban areas can be contaminated with a lot of different materials. If it runs off into natural bodies of water, it can contaminate them as well. But there are benefits to urbanization. People living in very urban areas likely can use public transportation rather than driving individual vehicles, and that reduces carbon emissions. If you think about New York City, for example, people there rely very much on the subway, on bus systems to move around the city, and many people don't own their own car. Okay, one thing that does is it reduces the carbon footprint of people living in those areas, whereas people in the suburbs have to drive longer distances. Multiple cars are usually present within a family. People have to commute to work using those cars oftentimes. Shopping or stores are far away, so you have to drive there. If we look, this is the carbon footprint of households in the greater New York City area. What we see here in the areas of Long Island, Westchester, New Jersey here, and then we see here, this is Manhattan, okay? This is Brooklyn and Queens. These areas you see have some of the lowest carbon footprints of this region. And again, that's because of these things I was just talking about. There are some environmental benefits of living in these urban areas, and reduced carbon footprint is one of those.